Thanks for clicking. My name is Mark Mitchell. I'm a mortgage broker here in London, Ontario. We had a lot of updates out of China this week as the Evergrande Crisis continued to get worse. The United States, for its part, finally recognized that Evergrande and the real estate crisis in China could very well hurt the global economy and the economy of the United States. We also had a number of major developments out from Evergrande this week, and more news that the contagion is continuing to spread throughout China as the banks and the government officials are starting to get more and more involved in this crisis.
You want me to be your partner? That's what you're trying to tell me. You want me to be your partner? Yeah.
So what I want to do today is go over the major developments with Evergrande, as I think there were some updates which will show what we might be in for when and if the real estate developer does actually default on its debt and bankruptcy occurs. And then I want to go over the contagion that is spreading, as we'll see more and more key stakeholders, being banks, real estate developers, and the government, are starting to get involved in this crisis. So I think that really shows how much the contagion is spreading. And then I want to look at what the United States and the Federal Reserve have said about the Evergrande crisis and China's real estate in general, as I think it really succinctly summarizes what we might be in for as this crisis continues to unfold and it continues to spread beyond China's borders. We will have some more updates out next week as the inflationary data from Canada is set to be released on Wednesday, and judging from the inflation data just released by the United States showing over 6% inflation, highest since 1990, I think that Canada is probably going to follow suit and will probably be in for some rate hikes sooner rather than later. Click like and subscribe to get those updates, but for now, let's get into Evergrande. So when we talked last week, it was unclear whether or not Scenery Journey, a unit of Evergrande, would make its bond payment that was due on Saturday. It did not, in fact, make that bond payment, which triggered another 30-day grace period for Evergrande to come up with the money.
Feel like Groundhog Day transpiring here because it seems like every week, of course, there's new deadlines and payments missed.
So while Evergrande did, in fact, miss their Saturday payment, all eyes were on Wednesday to see if they would make their payment that was due following a 30-day grace period from the payment they missed in October. This payment was a big deal, as if Evergrande would have missed this one, it would have triggered a cross default across all of their other bonds, or a lot of their other bonds, which would have very well triggered bankruptcy. So all eyes were watching to see what happened with Evergrande on Wednesday, and while they did in fact make their payment, the big news was the confusion surrounding whether or not they did make their payment and what happened thereafter. If you were looking online on Wednesday, as I'm sure everybody was, to see whether or not Evergrande made that payment, you would see there was a lot of cross claims, with some saying that a formal default had occurred and that Evergrande would be filing for bankruptcy immediately. And then a few hours later, it came out that no, they actually did make their payment despite all these claims. So there was a lot of confusion that came out, and throughout this confusion, we saw a major drop in the price of not only U.S. stocks, which did fall, but also a 4% drop in the price of Bitcoin. This was thousands of dollars off the price of Bitcoin, all because everyone was confused and worried about Evergrande. So it does seem like every week we're saying, oh, are they going to make this payment? Are they going to make this payment? And it does seem to get a little redundant as we've seen. But I think this kind of gave us a really good foreshadowing of what will happen when and if the company does default, as just some confusion over whether or not it was going to default led to major drops in the U.S. stock market and into Bitcoin. And we're going to get into this later. An Evergrande default will have major global implications, which I think is being more and more recognized. Now, last week we talked about how was Evergrande getting the money, and we saw this week that they actually they sold 2 of their private jets, and they sold a huge stake in their tech firm, which was able to get them the money to come up with to make their bond payment. But I also think we're starting to see more of a robbing Peter to pay Paul type scenario, as they're just missing one bond payment and then paying another, and then missing another bond payment and then paying another. And this goes on, but it can't go on forever, especially with Evergrande having so many bond payments due in the months and years ahead. Sooner or later, it is going to run out of non-real estate assets to sell. Most of its assets are in real estate, and as Bloomberg noted, it is having a very, very difficult time selling those assets. The reason for this being is that the only ones that would buy real estate assets are other real estate developers. And given the liquidity crunch that's been going on throughout China and spreading, as we'll see, the real estate developers that do have money that could buy the assets don't want to due to the liquidity problems. So this is kind of a self-perpetuating cycle that's been going on with Evergrande, and it's definitely getting worse. Which brings us to the Contagion. It came out that on Monday, numerous developers, banks, and government officials from government-run think tanks met to see if they could find a solution to this growing crisis. Keza, a real estate developer that we have talked about in the past, actually had its shares suspended last week, and then it was in this meeting with the banks and developers, pleading with the banks and government officials to help with the liquidity crisis. Keza actually asked that they help with project acquisitions and strategic buys. Project acquisitions and strategic buys, what they're saying is that they are hoping to sell their projects to the government, to these banks. Because they can't sell their projects to other real estate developers because there's no money, they're looking to the government for help. And if this sounds familiar, it should. Back in 2008, a lot of the banks turned to the U.S. government to sell its toxic assets, which was another word for mortgages where nobody were making their payments. So you can't sell those mortgages to other banks because they don't want them. So the only buyer left is to the government to help get some liquidity, get some cash, so you can meet your obligations. It's very similar. Those were banks in 2008, and this is a real estate developer. Well, we can really see them running out of options and having to turn to the government for help. This is a very big sign of the contagion spreading, and that these developers are running out of options to figure this out on their own. They've tried selling assets, credit extensions, etc., etc. And when you run out of solutions on your own, you have to go to mom and dad for help. So I think this is definitely showing that this crisis is spreading and it's getting worse, and the developers are running out of options. They're going to the government, they're going to the banks to try to find kind of a lender of last resort, as it were. But we spoke at the beginning of this crisis and in recent weeks about how as this crisis gets worse and worse, it's going to garner more and more attention. One, out of the media outlets, but as it seems now, out of the United States and out of the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is the central bank for the biggest economy in the world and prints the money of the world reserve currency. So, when you grab the attention of the Federal Reserve, it is a big deal.
Because I make the money. I'm the big mamoo around here.
Obviously, the Fed has its own problems with its money printing, it being late to the game with interest rate.
And I don't mean to cast aspersions on a guy, but he's going to get us all killed.
Which are beyond the scope of this video, but the central bank for the world's biggest economy, what they have to say matters and should be taken seriously. The Federal Reserve released its financial stability report, and in it they expressed a lot of concerns over Evergrande and China, and expressed concerns that this could have a major impact on the global economy and the economy of the United States. Financial stresses in China could strain global financial markets through a deterioration of risk sentiment. This is the key takeaway both from the Evergrande Crisis and from the Federal Reserve report, the deterioration of risk sentiment. So that's where if investors start to look on to what's happening in China and in Evergrande and the real estate prices there, they can and will and have started to pull their money, and much worse than even pulling their money is sitting on their money. This is readily apparent in China right now, and what has been going on there is investors are sitting on their money. Nobody wants to purchase these troubled assets, these troubled real estate assets, because they don't know which way the wind's going to blow. They don't know where their money's going to be in a few years, so they don't invest. When investors don't invest, money dries up, the economy slows down to a halt. And that's the big worry. That's always been the big worry over what was happening in China, is that money would dry up and that would spread throughout China and then throughout the globe. It does appear as though this spread is already starting to occur, at least somewhat. As we saw, even at the mere prospect or a bit of a confusion over whether or not Evergrande had defaulted, Bitcoin, which has been on an astronomical tear throughout the past couple months and really the past couple years, saw its price drop by 4% just over a brief confusion over Evergrande. You can't even use Bitcoin in China, and because the Communist Party banned it a few months back. But just the prospect of Evergrande defaulting was enough to sink those shares as investors started to pull their money, because investors, it does hurt risk sentiment, which, like I said, has always been the big worry. I do expect that we are going to have more updates out on this, especially as the US is starting to express more and more concern over this crisis. As we've said at the beginning, and as I think has become readily apparent throughout these updates, that as more and more eyes get put on China and on this problem, more and more updates come out, and we start to get an even better idea of how bad the situation really is. We will have more updates on it next week, next Friday, so make sure you click like and subscribe to get those updates, and thanks so much for watching.